There is a photograph that the Belgian palace spent nearly 30 years praying you would never see. In it, an elderly former king sits beside a red-haired woman he once insisted was a stranger to him. They are not embracing, they are barely turned toward one another. And yet everything in the frame, the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, the quiet, exhausted relief on both their faces, says the one thing the crown fought for decades to deny. These two people share the same blood. I'm Edmund Hale, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of the woman in that photograph, a daughter a king refused to claim, not in a single moment of weakness, but again and again, for almost 3 decades. He denied her when she was a child who called for him. He denied her when she was a grown woman, asking for nothing but the truth. He denied her even when a court of law ordered him, in plain language, to take a simple test, and he refused, choosing to be fined 5,000 euros a day, every day, rather than let science say aloud what his own heart had always known. To understand how that is even possible, how a man can look at his own child and call her a lie, you have to go back to the 1960s, to a Belgium that no longer exists, and to a prince the history books had not yet learned to fear. His name was Albert, Prince of Liège. He was the younger brother of a king, second in line to a throne he never expected to sit on, and by every account of the time, restless inside a life that had been arranged for him. In 1959 he had married an Italian noblewoman, Paola Ruffo di Calabria, a marriage the newspapers adored and the private world found complicated almost from the start. And it was into that complication that a woman named Sibylle de Célie-Longchamp walked. A Belgian baroness, elegant, independent, married herself. What began between Albert and Sibylle in the mid-1960s was not a rumor that flared and died, it endured. By most accounts it lasted the better part of 18 years, a parallel life, conducted in discreet houses and careful arrangements, hidden in plain sight from a nation that believed it knew its royal family completely. Keep that number in your mind, 18 years, because when a palace later tries to tell you a child was a misunderstanding, a footnote, a stranger, that number is the first thing that gives them away. In 1968, on the 22nd of February, that hidden life produced a daughter. They named her Delphine. And here is the detail that would haunt everything that followed. In the beginning she was not hidden at all, not inside the walls. Among the people who knew, the truth was simply a fact of the household, a prince who came and went, a little girl with unmistakable red hair, a childhood conducted in the strange, warm, unstable air of a secret that everyone around her seemed to share. She grew up creative, headstrong, drawn to art the way some children are drawn to noise. She did not fit the tidy shape a palace prefers its children to take, and for a while it did not seem to matter. But secrets have a gravity of their own, and the higher Albert rose toward the throne, the heavier that gravity became. Somewhere in Delphine's childhood, the door that had been left ajar began, quietly, to close. The visits grew rarer, the arrangements grew colder, and a little girl who had once simply known who her father was, began slowly to be taught the far crueler lesson that knowing a truth and being allowed to say it are two entirely different things. She was, in the language the palace would never use, becoming an inconvenience. And in the world of crowns, an inconvenient truth is not corrected, it is buried. What happened next is the story of how deep they were willing to dig. To understand why that door closed, You have to understand what a monarchy is truly built to protect. Not a person, not even a family, an institution. The Belgian crown, like every crown in Europe, survives on a single unspoken promise that the story it tells about itself will never be contradicted by the truth. And a prince with a secret daughter is a contradiction waiting to happen. For most of the 1970s and into the 1980s, that contradiction was managed the way the powerful always manage such things, with distance, with silence, and with arrangements. Sybil and her daughter were in effect moved to the margins of the story. Delphine grew up between worlds, privileged, yes, but adrift, connected to one of the most powerful families in Europe, and yet unable to speak that connection aloud. She would later describe a childhood shadowed by something she could sense but not name, a father who was present and absent at once, a truth that filled every room and was never once spoken in it. Picture what that does to a child. Every family photograph with a space in it, every question at school that has to be deflected, every birthday that a certain man does not attend for reasons no one will explain. She was not poor, and she was not abandoned in the ordinary sense, but she was erased, gently, expensively, and completely. If you have ever grown up sensing that the most important fact about your own life was the one nobody would say out loud, then you already understand Delphine better than the palace ever wanted you to. Stay with me because she is about to stop being quiet. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all was climbing. And then, in 1993, the unthinkable happened. Albert's older brother, King Baudouin, died suddenly and without children of his own. The throne no one had expected Albert to inherit fell overnight onto his shoulders. The restless Prince of Liège became Albert II, King of the Belgians. And with that crown came a new and absolute imperative. The past had to stay buried. A prince might survive an old rumor. A king could not. For 6 years it held. The secret stayed sealed behind the palace walls, protected by the oldest instinct in royal history, that some doors, once closed, are never opened again. But truth, as Delphine would spend her life proving, does not respect a locked door. In 1999, a young Belgian journalist named Mario Daniels published a biography of Queen Paola. Buried inside it was a single, carefully worded passage, a reference to a long affair, and to a daughter born from it. It was not a headline. It was not an accusation. It was, at first, barely a whisper, but it was enough. For the first time, the secret the crown had guarded for 3 decades was printed in black and white, sitting in bookshops across the country. And here is where the true character of an institution reveals itself, not in how it behaves when it is comfortable, but in what it does the moment it is threatened. Belgium did not receive a confirmation. It did not receive an honest denial. It received the oldest weapon the powerful have ever wielded against the inconvenient. Nothing. A wall of silence. No comment, no acknowledgement. Just the quiet, deliberate calculation that if they said nothing at all, the woman at the center of it would eventually look like the one who was lying. They were betting on her silence. It is the same bet the powerful always make. And in a moment you'll see exactly why this time it failed. For Delphine, the years after 1999 were a particular kind of torment, the torment of being almost seen. The secret was out, and yet nothing changed. The world now suspected who her father was. Her father knew. And still the one thing she asked for, acknowledgement, a single word said out loud, was refused. In 2005, King Albert delivered a Christmas address that, to most of the country, sounded like an ordinary royal message. But to those who knew, one passage landed differently. He spoke obliquely of happy memories and of moments of crisis in his own life, and of reconciliation within his marriage. It was as close as he would ever come in those years to admitting that something had happened, and it was nowhere near close enough. It named nothing. It claimed no one. To Delphine, watching like the rest of the nation, it must have felt like being gestured at through frosted glass by the one person who could have simply opened the door. She tried, for years, to resolve it privately, to spare everyone, including the family that would not claim her, the spectacle of a public fight. Those efforts went nowhere. Because an institution has no incentive to give quietly what it can force you to take publicly, at ruinous cost. Remember that, because it is the cold engine beneath this entire story. The Crown would rather you exhaust yourself in silence than hand you the truth for free. And so, at last, Delphine made the decision that would define her life. If they would not say it, she would prove it. In 2013, a year that would turn out to be the hinge of the whole saga, she took the fight into the one arena where a king's word carried no more weight than anyone else's, a court of law. The timing was extraordinary, because 2013 was also the year that Albert, citing age and health, did something Belgian kings almost never do. He abdicated. In July of that year, he stepped down from the throne and handed the crown to his son, Philippe. The official story was one of a dignified, voluntary retirement. But the shadow of Delphine's coming legal action hung over that decision, and many in Belgium have never quite believed the two things were unrelated. Whatever the reason, the effect was this. As Albert laid down his crown, his daughter picked up her case. At first, the law itself stood in her way. Under Belgian law, Delphine's legal father was Jacques Boël, the industrialist to whom her mother had been married. Before she could even ask a court to recognize Albert, she first had to legally undo the fatherhood of the man whose name she had carried her entire life. Imagine the strangeness of that. To claim one father, she had first, formally, to unclaim another. It was the legal system's version of the same cruelty she had lived with all along, a truth everyone knew, buried under paperwork designed to keep it buried. And just when she thought the hardest part would be the science, the man on the other side of that courtroom made a decision that would shock even his defenders. What he did next turned a private family matter into a national scandal. What Albert did was simple and staggering. He refused, not to deny in words. He had done that for decades. This was something else. As the case ground forward, the central question became almost childishly simple to resolve. A DNA test, a swab, a few minutes, one result that would end the entire dispute in either direction, permanently. And the former king, the man who had spent his life as a symbol of duty and service, declined to give it. Think about what that refusal actually was. It was not the act of a man confident in his innocence. An innocent man takes the test in an afternoon and walks away vindicated. This was the act of a man who knew exactly what the test would show, and who was willing to spend the credibility of a crown to avoid hearing it said out loud. Hold on to that, because it is the moral center of this entire story. Sometimes the most powerful confession a person can make is everything they will do to avoid confessing at all. The case climbed through the Belgian courts, year after grinding year. Appeals, delays, legal arguments about jurisdiction, about privacy, about the dignity of a former head of state. Each one bought time. Each one asked Delphine to spend more of her life, more of her resources, more of her spirit, simply to be told what she had always known. And through all of it, the machinery of the institution did what it does best. It protected itself, patiently, expensively, and without a flicker of the human warmth it demanded from everyone else. But Delphine had something the machine had underestimated. She was not fighting for money. The courts and the public came to understand that clearly. She was not fighting for a palace or a place in the line of succession. She was fighting for the one thing that cannot be bought and cannot be legislated away, to be acknowledged by her own father before he died. And a person fighting for that is very difficult to exhaust. Slowly, the tide of the courtroom and of the country began to turn. In 2018, a court ordered the DNA test outright. Albert's lawyers resisted still. And so, in 2019, the court did something almost unheard of for a former monarch. It attached a price to his silence. For every single day that Albert refused to provide a sample, he would be fined 5,000 euros. Read that again. 5,000 euros a day. Not for a crime of violence, not for corruption, for refusing to answer, with science, whether a woman was his daughter. And even then, even with the meter running, he let the days accumulate. A former king of the Belgians, choosing a mounting public penalty over the truth about his own child. The country watched, and the mood shifted. Because there is a moment in every story like this when the public stops seeing a scandal and starts seeing a person, a daughter, standing alone against the entire weight of an institution, asking only to be claimed. Delphine had become that person, and the palace, for all its lawyers and all its centuries, was losing the one battle it could not afford to lose, the battle for sympathy. What happened next did not just settle a case, it rewrote the ending everyone had been bracing for. By the end of 2019, the pressure had become unsustainable. The fines were public, the courts were immovable, and the story had escaped the control of the palace entirely. It now belonged to the country, and the country had chosen its side. For a man who had spent his life guarding a secret, there was, at last, nowhere left to hide. And so, finally, Albert did the thing he had resisted for a generation. He gave the sample. I want you to sit for a moment in the strangeness of that surrender. Everything, the 18-year relationship, the closed door of a childhood, the wall of silence in 1999, the abdication, the years of appeals, the daily fine, all of it had been in service of one goal, to never let this test happen. And now it was happening. A swab, a sealed envelope, a laboratory in which for once no title and no tradition and no centuries of protocol counted for anything at all. Just chemistry, just the truth, waiting to be read. Before I tell you what that envelope said, understand what was truly inside it. Not a percentage, not a legal fact, but the single word a woman had waited more than 50 years to hear. Stay with me, because this is the moment the silence finally breaks. In January of 2020, the result came back. And it was not close. It was not ambiguous. It did not leave room for lawyers or spin or one last careful non-denial. Albert II, former king of the Belgians, was Delphine's biological father. Beyond doubt, beyond argument, beyond the reach of any wall he could build. After 21 years of public denial, after a childhood spent behind a closing door, after 7 years of courtrooms and appeals, and a fight that had cost her more than most of us could imagine, a single line of science said what a father never would. She was his. And to his credit, because even in a story like this, the human truth is more complicated than a villain and a saint, Albert did not fight the result. He accepted it. In a written statement, the man who had denied her for a generation acknowledged, at last, that Delphine was his daughter. It was late. It was forced. It came only after the truth had been dragged into the light against his will. But it came. The courts moved quickly then to give back what the silence had stolen. In October of 2020, a Belgian appeals court ruled that Delphine was entitled to everything a legitimate child of the king would have received. She was no longer Delphine Boël, the woman the palace had spent decades treating as a rumor. She became Her Royal Highness Princess Delphine of Belgium, of Saxe-Coburg. Her 2 children, Josephine and Oscar, became a princess and a prince. The secret the crown had tried for half a century to bury walked in through the front door of the royal family. Not as a scandal, as a daughter. But the title was never really the point. What happened in the weeks that followed was something the law could never have ordered, and it is the part of this story I think about most. Because a name on a court document is one thing, a father is another. In the autumn of 2020, something happened that no judge could have compelled, and no institution could have staged. Delphine and Albert met, privately, quietly, as father and daughter, for the first time in the light. And not long after, the world was shown that photograph. The old former king and the red-haired woman he had spent decades denying, sitting together at last. She met Paula, too, the queen she had spent her entire life being a secret from. And in the images that followed, there was no anger left, only 2 people, and the strange, exhausted grace of a family somehow beginning again. Delphine has said, in the time since, that she never wanted revenge, that everything, the lawsuits, the fines, the years, was only ever about this, the right to belong to her own family, and to give her children the truth she had been denied. Her art, which had for years channeled the pain of that erasure, changed. The woman who had been the family's secret was, at last, simply part of the family. And this is where I have to tell you what this story has taught me, after a lifetime spent watching these families. If you have ever been made to feel like the inconvenient truth in someone else's story, I want you to hear this next part clearly, because it is the reason I tell these stories at all. An institution will always protect itself first. It will let a woman be called a liar. It will spend years and fortunes and the credibility of a crown before it will admit that it was wrong. That is not cruelty by accident. It is cruelty by design, because an institution has no heart to overrule its instinct for survival. Albert the man may have felt 100 private agonies, but Albert inside the machine did what the machine required for as long as it required it. And yet, a single person, stubborn, unglamorous, refusing to disappear, turned out to be stronger than all of it. Delphine did not raise an army. She did not topple a throne. She did something far more difficult and far more lasting. She stood in front of the entire weight of a monarchy and with nothing but patience and the truth, she made it say her name. That is the part they never tell you at the coronations and the jubilees. That behind the gold and the ceremony, the crown's deepest instinct is not love, it is silence. And the only thing that has ever reliably defeated that silence is an ordinary person who simply refuses to be quiet. Delphine was that person, and the next time you see one of these families smiling from a balcony, remember the daughter they spent 30 years pretending did not exist, and remember how close they came to winning. If this story stayed with you, then subscribe, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments, do you believe Albert was protecting the crown or himself? And then come with me to the next one, because there is another royal secret in another palace that a family fought just as hard to bury, and it's waiting for you right now. I'm Edmund Hale. The crown weighs heavy, but the truth weighs more. I'll see you there.